So what exactly is the flipped classroom? Let's go ahead and talk about what the traditional classroom tends to look like. And going back to our model of temp, the traditional classroom tends to say that in class, the teacher is going to teach you something. So show a definition, show a formula, show some sort of process. They're then going to show you some examples of how that works in action. They will then hopefully model how they, as the expert, works through a unfamiliar and new problem. But then they reserve the idea of homework or practice as that which is taken care of outside of class. There are some challenges with this model. No model of teaching is perfect by any means, nor will it reach every single student. So this traditional model may work for many kids, many schools, many topics and skills. There are some downsides to this though. One is that practice is separated from the teaching. And so if you have a first hour where I've shown you how to do some sort of mathematical equation and how to balance both sides of that algebra piece, it may be 6 hours later that you are asked to go back to that worksheet. And so for a kid who's barely hanging on, if you separate 6 hours from that initial teaching moment, that could be a problem. Unfortunately, also, most practice tends to be done alone. So for some students, that's great. They're at that independent level with the skill. But for those kids that are needing a little bit more time, a little bit more support, and they're forced to do this on the school bus, on the city bus, at home, while babysitting a younger brother or sister, this practice is done alone. And if there's any questioning about what they're supposed to be doing, students often find themselves without support. There are probably few experts around them to help them with whatever they're asking. From our end, from the teaching end, the challenge with this is that if you're out there lecturing about the Cuban Missile Crisis or whatever, if you haven't captured that in some way, once it's gone, it's gone. Think about the kid who was absent. Think about the kid who was gone for 3 days on the cruise, the kid who was gone for 2 days because of sports, because of a funeral, because of moving into the district late, whatever it is. How do they get that initial teaching moment if you did it by lecture and there's no ability to recreate that? Moving into what the flipped classroom model actually is, what we try to do is, I know this is not creative, but we try to flip the whole process. We try to make the homework piece, the out-of-class piece, to be the direct instruction, the showing, the defining, the bare bones showing of what something is. Depending on what that item is, how complex it is, we might be able to even squeeze in a couple examples of that term or that equation. We might be even able to show them how we're doing it in the modeling steps, depending on the technology you have at your disposal. And then what happens is students would watch that video or read that piece or watch that PowerPoint or Glogster or whatever item you're using to front load the material. And then the in-class time is used to practice what they just learned and to apply it to ideally more abstract concepts. For example, perhaps you're teaching the simile. In a podcast, I could tell a student what a simile is by definition. I could show them examples in common pieces of poetry or song lyrics. I could then pull out a song that I've never seen before and walk through that and explain my thinking to the students and say, hey, oh great, I'm reading this. Oh look, there is a simile. Something was like something. So I could be talking through, I could be recording that sound. If I have the technology, I could be recording my screen, things like that. Then when we get to the class portion, I would check for understanding. What kind of questions do you have from last night's podcast? What kind of gaps do you have? What things were not clear? What's going on in your brain? What clarifying questions do you have? We can then start practicing together. Maybe we can do one poem as a class, read it aloud. What similes do you see? Great, we've pointed them out in lines 5, 12, 25, whatever. Let's work together and construct meaning. What does this mean as a poem? What is its theme based on its use of similes? That's a much harder question. Might be a good idea to start asking questions like that with other people around, whether it be me as an expert, classmates as an expert, homogeneous groupings as experts, that kind of stuff. We can then release some of the responsibility from us and put more of that responsibility on them in the classroom environment because they have some more support. Because this is a biased podcast toward moving some of your lessons, or maybe all of your lessons, toward the flipped classroom idea, here are some of the benefits. I think, like I said in the last slide, the practice and application steps are done in a controlled environment. We don't have to worry about the student trying to remember how to do calculus on the school bus. We can be there to remind them, and if they need more support, we can provide that or direct them to students who get it a little bit sooner or easier. If they don't need that help, they can move through the application processes a little bit more quickly and more independently. I also see that the watching of podcasts as direct instruction as a responsibility shift. I feel that students are more responsible for this learning, for their own learning. In the past, they've been able to sit in a class, close the eyes, maybe they're absorbing some of the lecture, maybe they're not, and then they get turned loose to do their homework. They come in the next day and say, man, I couldn't do this. And maybe they couldn't because they just didn't grasp it, or because they didn't have time, or their dog ate it, or whatever. But it's pretty easy for them to just say, you know what, I couldn't remember what I was supposed to do, therefore I couldn't do it. I think the shift of actual learning is placed a little bit more on them because they are being asked to do these things preemptively. And if they have questions about the material, they can review it, rewind it, play it again, do it more slowly. On the flip side, if they already grasp that concept for whatever reason, they've heard it in middle school or another class or whatever, they can scrub through the podcast or glance through the Glogster, whatever you're using for the flipped part, and speed through it. So perhaps some of your quicker learners can move past that concept onto something more advanced. I know for me, it's exceptionally difficult in a class of 30 or 35 or whatever to really say, here's 35 different levels of this lesson. So when I'm presenting traditionally and lecturing about it, every single kid's got to hear about the simile. And then on their own time, they might be able to practice at different levels if I have different leveled readings for them. But then again, they're turned loose. So maybe I have found that perfect level of challenge for my gifted kid with this great poem, but they're on their own. Maybe they got it in class because the example was easy, but now they're turned loose. They need some help. Bummer, nobody's there to help. But by flipping that, they can get the basics at home, and then we can differentiate in the class, both at an accelerated pace and at a little bit slower pace and everything in between. Clearly, there are going to be challenges to this model. One is, how do we directly instruct without being in the room with the students? Is it going to be something reading-based? And I think English teachers have been doing this for years. Hey kids, read chapter 5 of To Kill a Mockingbird. We're going to talk about this tomorrow. Well, what if they don't read? What if your big assessment is discussion? They didn't read, they can't discuss. That's a bummer. How else could we do it? Well, if it's internet-based, how do we make these things? How do we record a podcast? How do we make a screencast, which is what you're seeing now, where I'm just recording my screen? That takes some different technological things than most people have in their classroom computer. Also, how do kids access these lessons? While many kids do have access to the internet at home, many don't. Many have spotty connections. So we can't completely say, you know what, our entire curriculum is on YouTube, kids. Go get it. There's a lot of kids that don't have regular access to that, so we can't rely on that. That is not equitable, and that becomes an issue. Additionally, these podcasts, screencasts, are time intensive. While this may be 15 minutes long, it's probably going to take me 30 minutes to record it, recording over all of the screw-ups I make, all the hacking and coughing and ums and all the verbal pauses I make, and then I need to edit again. So that's going to take me probably at least an hour and a half after the recording is done to make 15 minutes. I don't know about you, but as a teacher, I work a lot of hours. I don't have a lot of time to sit and play with the video. So how much time do you want to spend on something like this? That's another consideration. Obviously, what if they don't do it? We've talked about that. It happens in any class. What if they don't do this one element for a large project? We see the big snowball effect. They often don't, but we do. And now if you're putting direct instruction out there, if they're not getting it, that provides a pretty big gap, because now they're not missing homework practice, they're missing direct instruction.